How could this happen in just a few days? I screamed, looking at my living room. I had been in the hospital to give birth, and in the mere few days I was away. In just that short period, the living room was filled with the smell of rotting food. Unfinished cereal bowls were left on the table, with milk and leftover ingredients floating inside. There were also plastic cases and trays, probably leftovers from ready-made meals, scattered all over the floor. Around it, I could see many things that looked like fruit flies. Cleaning and tidying up is a wife's job, right? So I waited, leaving everything as it was until you got discharged, my husband said, swatting at the small bugs flying around the light. He then turned to look at me, covering my nose from the stench, and frowned. See, you can't live in such a stinky room, right? Clean it up quickly. I was speechless. Couldn't he see the baby in my arms? My name is Hannah, a 28-year-old office worker. I've been working at the company I joined right out of college, surrounded by respected superiors and colleagues. I married Ken, a man 2 years my senior who I met at the same company. We continued working after marriage, being both good rivals at work and partners at home. We had a fulfilling life, supporting each other through challenges. About a year into our marriage, I discovered I was pregnant. That was a joyous moment since we wanted a child. Our parents, including my in-laws who had always been kind since we started dating, were overjoyed, shedding tears of happiness. My in-laws have been kind to us since we first started dating. When I first went to their house to introduce myself before our marriage, they welcomed me warmly. After getting married, living close to my in-laws, I often went out with my mother-in-law on weekends, building a good relationship. I told my husband, "Your parents are truly compassionate and wonderful." He nodded and said, "My mom quit her job after getting married and has always been a wonderful mother, taking care of the home. My dad worked from morning till night and wasn't home much, but he always showed love and gratitude to my mom within that time." Hearing this, I felt again that they were a wonderful couple who deeply cared for each other. After we got married, my mother-in-law would often express her concern, saying, "Values in marriage have changed over time, and as long as Hannah and Ken are living a life they're happy with, that's all that matters." But, since Hannah continues to work after marriage, I worry that her share of household chores might increase too much after living together. I reassured her with a smile, "Don't worry. My husband and I share the household chores well and are able to cooperate together." Seeing this, my mother-in-law appeared relieved. Ken and I started living together after getting married. Knowing this, my mother-in-law probably worried about whether we were able to live together without any issues. Of course, there were uncertainties about getting married without living together in advance. However, throughout our time dating, Ken was always kind to me and never forgot to be considerate. No matter how many years passed, he truly was a wonderful person. Therefore, I was confident that we could live together without any problems. He kept our agreements and never pushed all the household chores onto me. In fact, he often expressed wanting to reduce my load. My kind husband, even after learning about my pregnancy, said, "If something happens to our precious child, it would be troubling, so I want you to rely on me when we're together." He managed to do the household chores in between his busy schedule. During the early stages of pregnancy, I had severe morning sickness, often missing work. I've always juggled work and household chores, often feeling guilty for not doing enough. Seeing my husband go to work every day without fail, I felt I should at least handle the chores, but my poor health often got in the way. "I'm sorry. I couldn't do anything today," I once cried to my husband, to which he replied, "Hey, no need to apologize. I've lived alone for a long time, so household chores aren't a big deal for me. You're doing a great job carrying our baby. I can't fully understand your pain, but let me take care of the housework." He always cared for my well-being. Lately, my husband has been very diligent, buying parenting books and studying them every day. Seeing this made me realize how lucky I was to have married him. My pregnancy went smoothly, and our baby was growing well, thanks to the support of our parents and in-laws. As the due date approached and my belly grew, I took maternity leave, focusing on staying healthy. Although my belly was getting larger and going out was becoming a struggle, I managed to go for my prenatal checkups while taking care of my body. Though it was tough to go out with my growing belly, my mother-in-law, who lives nearby, started accompanying me to my prenatal appointments. She would carry my bag and stay by my side, making me feel grateful despite my initial reluctance to accept her help. At first, I felt apologetic for having her accompany me and declined, but my mother-in-law said, "My kids are grown up and I have a lot of free time. Going with you, Hannah, is pretty much all I have to do. Of course, I'm worried about your health, but it also serves as exercise for me, so it's killing two birds with one stone," she said happily. With that in mind, I decided to rely on my mother-in-law, and we went to the prenatal checkup together that day. One day, while at the hospital for a routine checkup, I suddenly felt intense abdominal pain. Noticing something was wrong with me, the doctor quickly said, "I'll perform an internal examination," and examined me while calming my panicked state. The doctor examined me and said, "You're having contractions and your water has broken. We need to admit you. You'll meet your baby soon." I was unprepared for the suddenness. My mother-in-law held my hand, reassuring me that she would stay by my side. Gradually accepting the situation, I prepared myself for the birth. Once I calmed down a bit, my mother-in-law said, "I'll go and get the necessary things. I'll be right back. I'll also call Ken." Then she hurried out of the hospital. When she returned, she immediately asked how I was feeling and if I was in pain. "Thank you so much," I said, to which she shook her head, holding my hand and smiling, "It's nothing. Ken might be able to leave work early and be here for the birth. I've also called your parents." I had forgotten to call my parents in pain and anxiety. But they were on their way from the next town. My father-in-law arrived soon after, waiting in the corridor and saying, "It's finally happening." When my parents arrived, they deeply thanked my in-laws for being by my side throughout the hospital preparations, and now they reassured me, saying everyone was with me. My in-laws smiled and said it was good they made it in time. With my family around me, I felt much stronger, despite the intensifying contractions. Several hours later, in the middle of the night, I gave birth to a healthy baby. My in-laws and parents quietly celebrated in the waiting area so as not to disturb others. Relieved, I was moved by the sight of my baby but a bit disappointed that Ken wasn't there. He was supposed to have left work early, but he hadn't arrived by the next morning. My in-laws tried calling my husband several times to see if something had happened, but they couldn't reach him. Even at 9 a.m., he still hadn't shown up, and when my father-in-law went to our house, there was no answer, despite repeatedly ringing the doorbell. Finally, my mother-in-law called my husband's workplace. They knew I was in the hospital for childbirth and said my husband had left work early. He was supposed to be with me all day and had taken the day off, so he wasn't at the office. Everyone was in a panic. If he wasn't at home or work, we wondered if we should contact the police. But around noon, the receptionist informed us that my husband had arrived at the hospital. I was briefly relieved, but then I became anxious, wondering what had happened. However, I was speechless when I saw my husband enter the room. "Ah, the baby's been born." That was all my husband said at first. His suit was disheveled, his hair was messy. And as he got closer, I could smell alcohol. I couldn't believe he had gone drinking at such a time. And he was so engrossed in his phone that he didn't even glance at the baby. When I calmly asked him where he had been, he sleepily replied, Sorry. I went out for drinks. Couldn't turn down an old friend. Slept in and that's why I'm late." Since he was still engrossed in his phone, my anger exploded. But before I could say anything, my father-in-law grabbed my husband's shoulders. "What were you thinking? It doesn't matter how long it's been since you've seen your friends. There's no comparison between drinking with buddies and being there for your wife's childbirth. Why didn't you just say no?" My father-in-law was furious, and despite my husband's attempts to interject with "but" and "well," he eventually fell silent, sulking. He sighed loudly, without even looking at me or the baby, and quickly left the room. My father and father-in-law tried to follow him, but they couldn't keep up and he left the hospital. During my entire hospital stay, my husband never visited again. A few days after giving birth, with my family's support, my baby and I were healthy and ready to be discharged. As my parents, who had come from far away, were leaving, my mother-in-law told them, "Look forward to seeing you again. Leave Hannah to us." On the day of my discharge, my mother-in-law helped me walk, and my father-in-law assisted with our bags. That morning, after I texted my husband that I was being discharged, he immediately called. "Hello, Hannah? Glad you're getting discharged. I'll come pick you up and we'll drive home," he said. I hadn't expected him to call back, so I thought maybe he was feeling a bit remorseful. I told my mother-in-law that my husband would come to pick me up. "Sure, why not? Maybe Ken has spare time to come," she said with a chuckle. I told my husband, "I was planning to go with your parents, but I appreciate you coming." He replied, "Okay. Tell Mom and Dad they can head back now." After informing my in-laws that my husband was coming, they left, seeming relieved. After thanking the hospital staff and finishing the paperwork, I got into my husband's car. He didn't apologize for the other day, but he was in a good mood as he drove. Soon after returning home, even the short car ride left me on the verge of tears, as my body was still in pain. It made me wonder how all the mothers out there endure this pain and continue to bravely raise their children. Still, I tried to rally myself, thinking that my husband, who had been so enthusiastic about parenting, would be okay. Maybe he was just tired from everything that happened during my hospital stay, or maybe he was sulking after being scolded by his father. That must be all it was. I steeled myself for the shared task of raising our child and opened the front door. I hesitated, wondering what the smell could be, when my husband nonchalantly opened the living room door. The smell of rotting garbage overwhelmed me, making me feel nauseous. "Gee, that's a terrible smell. Hey, clean it up now." My husband ordered me high-handedly, looking oddly satisfied. "I waited for you while you were in the hospital for a couple of days. Clean this up now. I can't live in such a stinky house." I was holding our baby and had to suppress the urge to collapse. I asked my husband, trying to control my anger, "How can you live like this? What have you been doing?" He replied nonchalantly, "I just ate and slept, and this happened." Leftover food, unwashed dishes, laundry, and garbage were strewn everywhere. Our house was in a state of utter disarray. Seeing the mess, I couldn't help but mutter, "Stop joking. You never showed up at the hospital, and you've neglected the housework. You used to be proactive about cleaning. Why have you suddenly stopped doing anything?" My husband replied, "Why do I have to be scolded? You love your job, Hannah. You worked hard even after we got married and until you went on maternity leave. Housework is a wife's job, right? I thought you'd be happy to have some work waiting for you when you got back, so I left it all for you. Clean it up now that you're back." He seemed completely accustomed to the mess, nonchalantly relaxing on the sofa in the fly-infested living room. I couldn't possibly live in such filth, nor could I lay our baby on a clean towel in the bed. I couldn't clean while holding the baby, so I yelled at my husband, who was staring at his phone. "Do you think I can clean in this situation? If you won't do it, then at least hold the baby and stay at the entrance. I can't look after our child in this mess." But my husband looked utterly exasperated. "Why do I have to look after the baby? Housework and childcare are a wife's job. It's obvious that you should do it. You've been ordering me around since you got back. This is why women are no good. You're not pregnant anymore, but you're still acting like you are, trying to make your husband do all the work. You're the worst kind of wife." I reached my limit hearing this. "What's wrong with you? Why have you changed like this? How can you say such things? What happened to you while I was in the hospital?" I asked him, tears streaming down my face. My husband just groaned and looked away. He slapped his cheeks as if to psych himself up, then stood up from the sofa with determination. the old me spoiled my wife and turned her into a bad woman. But not anymore. I've decided to properly educate my wife as a husband." He looked pained as he said this. "I'm doing the right thing. I didn't completely ignore parenting. I even went to the hospital to pick you and the baby up. I've been clear that housework and childcare are your jobs. I'm becoming a responsible husband." I was speechless at his complete transformation. He continued, "I've got plans now. Going out for drinks with a friend. Make sure the house is clean before I get back. I won't help." Saying that, he left. I stood there, unable to move. Unable to comprehend how my kind husband had changed so drastically. What could have happened to turn a man, who used to share housework and was eagerly learning to be a good father, into this? Overwhelmed, I stared at the garbage-filled room until I couldn't take it anymore. Tears streamed down my face, wetting my baby's cheek. The baby, awakened by my crying, started to fuss, and I broke down, crying loudly. "Mom, I don't understand anymore. I need help." I sat down at the entrance and called my mother on my phone. As soon as I made the call, my mom said she'd come right away. While my dad drove, she listened to my story. She told me it was better to wait outside than stay in a dirty house. So I sat on the front porch with my baby, quietly crying under the bright sun. Soon, my parents arrived, and to my surprise, my in-laws were with them. My mother-in-law immediately apologized profusely. My parents stopped her, agreeing that my husband was to blame. It was only then that I had the chance to ask why my in-laws were here. With tears in her eyes, my mother-in-law said, "We didn't trust our son either. We thought he might be troubling you, Hannah, so we decided to go to your house without telling you. Then we met your parents and came here together. I'm so sorry for all the trouble our son, Ken, has caused." Before anyone could start apologizing again, I managed to stop them. My father-in-law, red-faced and trembling with anger, didn't say a word. But it was clear he was on the verge of exploding. They tried calling my husband, but there was no answer. "That idiot son of mine. When I see him next, I'll give him a piece of my mind," he muttered, taking deep breaths to calm down. Eventually, he gently told me, "You shouldn't be exerting yourself right now, Hannah. Come, get in my car. We'll clean the house for you, just wait here." He and my mother-in-law ushered me and the baby into the car, then went inside with my father-in-law. Moreover, my parents also entered the room, offering to help, and I could hear the screams of all four people. They must have opened the bug-infested, stinking living room. I held my baby tight in the car, feeling guilty. After a few hours, during which my father-in-law bought insecticide and they took out several bags of trash, the house was transformed. Thanks to their efforts, the house was free of bugs, aired out, and the smell was much better. They had cleaned every room, and I was incredibly grateful. That evening, my mom and mother-in-law cooked dinner. And it was the first time in a long while that I had someone else's cooking. The meal tasted especially good after the strict diet I followed during pregnancy, and I finished it quickly. The home-cooked meal temporarily eased my anger towards my husband. While waiting for Ken to return, the doorbell rang. As I hurried to answer, my father-in-law said, "Relax, Hannah. I'll handle it." He pressed the intercom and stared at the screen. Suddenly he shouted, "Ken!" I knew my husband had returned. But why did he ring the bell? We all quietly went to see, not wanting to wake the baby. To my shock, a man was dragging Ken into the house. Ken's face was red and swollen, and he was sobbing loudly. The man introduced himself as Harry, Ken's friend. "I'm sorry for bothering you. I didn't know about your situation when Ken invited me for drinks. I feel terrible for taking him out at such a difficult time," he apologized profusely. I asked Harry to stand up and looked at Ken, still crying. Harry explained, Ken was bragging about putting his wife in her place, so I asked for details. What he did was appalling. He wouldn't listen when I told him to go home, and he didn't even understand what he did wrong, so I ended up hitting him. "I'm sorry." We disbanded the drinking session, But I couldn't leave him crying, so I brought him home. As I apologized for the trouble, Ken suddenly looked up and yelled, "Just because you won the argument, you resort to violence. That's why you're still single. You don't get it because you're single. Housework and childcare are a wife's job. You're the worst for hitting me out of nowhere." I'm sorry, but seriously, what happened to you, Ken? You were normal the last time we met. Why have you suddenly started acting like a terrible husband? Harry looked genuinely puzzled, which made me feel again that my husband, Ken, had indeed changed his attitude abruptly. Ken, you never said anything like this before I went to the hospital for childbirth. Why did you suddenly start thinking that housework and childcare are solely a wife's job? I asked him again. Ken replied, "Housework and childcare are a woman's job." Everyone was saying that. I realized I was wrong all along. Everyone? Who are you talking about? People at work? Friends? Who are these people? I asked, looking him straight in the eye. Ken answered shortly, "People on the internet." What? You're taking the word of people on the internet? Are you kidding me? Harry raised his eyebrows in disbelief. Ken, looking frustrated, shoved his smartphone at Harry. Look at this. It says women earn less than men, so it's natural for them to do housework. Only women can bear children, so childcare is their responsibility. See, everyone agrees with this. Harry looked at the screen and exclaimed in shock. You believe the content of this site? Are you out of your mind? I took the phone from Harry and saw a site. It was filled with stories of husbands pushing housework and childcare onto their wives, with many comments praising such behavior. It was clear that everyone Ken referred to were opinions on an internet forum. Summing up Ken's rant, it seemed he had started visiting these sites just before I went to the hospital, leading him to believe he had been too lenient as a husband. During my hospital stay, he spent his time on these sites, convincing himself he was wrong. It seems he couldn't stop himself after posting on that site about changing his ways and seeing comments of encouragement in response. As a result, my husband came to view housework and childcare as solely a woman's responsibility. This was because he believed women were less capable at work and couldn't earn as much money as men. He had become convinced that if there were complaints, the solution was simply to earn more money. My parents and in-laws were furious, unlike me who was just speechless. They exclaimed, "Unbelievable. We didn't raise our son to think like this." Looking for support, Ken turned to Harry, who said coldly, "I've had enough. I can't be friends with someone like you. We're done after today." I joined in, confronting Ken, "Why would you prioritize the opinions of faceless people online over your wife and child? Are these internet strangers more trustworthy to you?" Ken seemed to have a moment of realization as he looked at me. To make matters worse, my mom said coldly to Ken, "It seems no one here shares those values, Ken. If you still think you're right, then we'll have to leave you. We have different beliefs." My dad added, "I can't leave my daughter, Hannah, with you any longer. It's not too late, Hannah. We're ready to welcome you and the baby home. Come to us if you need to." Ken, who had been ranting, suddenly quieted down. "I thought, but everyone, no, I mean," he stammered. Looking up at me, his face turned pale. "The most important person to me is Hannah. I wanted to be a good husband for her, so I searched the internet for information, and then Tears welled up in his eyes, and he suddenly knelt before me. "I'm sorry, Hannah. I was wrong." Seeing Ken in this state, his father, in a quiet voice filled with tears, asked, "Ken, I want to ask you something. Did you ever see or hear me say that housework and childcare were solely a woman's job when you were a child? Did I ever appear that way to you, as your father?" Ken shook his head and murmured, "Dad, you were always a wonderful father, fully supporting Mom by her side." Continuing, Ken admitted, "I got too caught up in what I read on the internet and lost sight of everything else. I'm truly sorry." He apologized to his parents. Witnessing his sudden flood of apologies, my parents said, "Hannah, it's up to you what to do next. We will support you whatever you decide." After thinking for a while, I told Ken there won't be a next time, deciding to forgive him this time. Since then, Ken has woken up from his extreme internet-influenced views. He struggles with unfamiliar chores and childcare while trying to connect with our child. I watched, wondering how long it would last, but my in-laws and parents seemed to share my sentiments. They kept him in check, and he's still doing his best. Childcare is more physically demanding than I imagined. You're always taking care of the house and our child while I'm at work, all by yourself. Thank you. If you're ever feeling unwell, don't hesitate to ask for help, he now says, showing his concern. Watching Ken smile as he holds our child makes me believe he can be a good father. I hope for our peaceful days to continue always.